The studio was cold that afternoon, not from the air, but from the silence. 5 people sat in a room built for sound, and no one was making any. Mick Fleetwood stared at the tape reels on the console, watching them spin without purpose. Lindsey Buckingham leaned back in his chair, arms crossed tight across his chest like he was holding something in. Christine McVie's fingers hovered over the piano keys but didn't press down. Stevie Nicks stood near the window, looking out at the Los Angeles skyline, but her eyes weren't seeing anything. John McVie wasn't even in the room. He was outside smoking his 3rd cigarette in 20 minutes because being inside felt like drowning. It was 1980. Fleetwood Mac had just come off the biggest album of their lives. Rumors had sold more than 30 million copies worldwide. They had played arenas that shook with applause. They had been on the cover of every magazine that mattered. Radio stations couldn't stop playing their songs. Critics called them geniuses. Fans waited in line for hours just to see them walk past. They had everything a band could want: money, fame, respect. Everything except the ability to be in the same room without feeling like the walls were closing in. The thing that made them great, the tension, the heartbreak, the unspoken war between Lindsey and Stevie, the quiet resentment between John and Christine, had turned into something else, something sharp, something that cut instead of burned. The music was still good, technically perfect even, but the room felt like a funeral. Every session felt like pulling teeth. Every conversation ended in silence or shouting. They were falling apart in slow motion, and everyone in the industry could see it. They needed help. Not a producer who would tell them what to do. Not a manager who would schedule their lives. They needed someone who understood what it felt like to stand in front of a microphone and sing about loss without flinching. Someone who knew how to turn pain into something people could hold in their hands. Someone who wouldn't try to fix them but might help them finish what they started. Someone who could walk into that burning room and not get consumed. Jackson Browne's name came up more than once in their desperate conversation. He was different from everyone else in the California rock scene. Quieter, more thoughtful. He didn't chase fame the way others did. He didn't party like the rest of them. He wrote songs that sounded like journal entries, slow and careful, with melodies that stayed in your chest for days. Songs about leaving and staying, about roads that led nowhere, about loving someone even after they were gone. He had just released Hold Out, and it had gone to #1 without him doing a single interview that felt fake. He didn't need to sell himself. His work spoke in a language Fleetwood Mac understood: regret, distance, the ache of knowing you can't go back. Mick Fleetwood made the call himself. He didn't delegate it to a manager or a record label executive. This was too important, too personal. He sat in his home office, staring at Jackson's number written on a piece of paper, and he took a breath before dialing. When Jackson picked up, Mick didn't waste time with small talk. He was honest in a way that surprised even himself. He told Jackson they were stuck, that the band was fracturing from the inside, that they had all this talent and all this history, and they were watching it crumble. He said they needed someone who could help them see past the wreckage, someone who understood what it meant to make art out of ruin. He didn't use the word join, not exactly, but it was there in every sentence. It was close enough that Jackson heard it clearly. Jackson Browne was in Los Angeles when the call came. He had just returned from a long tour that had left him tired in his bones. His hands still had calluses from the guitar strings. His voice was rough in the way that comes from singing the same song every night and meaning them every single time. He sat in his living room, the phone pressed to his ear, and he listened to Mick's voice on the other end of the line. Steady and careful, like a man trying not to beg. Jackson didn't interrupt. He let Mick finish. He let him say everything he needed to say. Then he sat with it, the weight of it, the implications of it. He knew what Fleetwood Mac was. Everyone did. They were a machine built on beauty and destruction. Lindsey's guitar work was surgical, precise, almost violent in its perfection. Stevie's voice was a ghost that refused to leave, haunting every song she touched. Christine's songs were the only things holding the band together, and even she looked exhausted in every interview, like she was carrying a weight no one else could see. John barely spoke anymore. Mick tried to be the glue, but glue only works if the pieces want to stay together. They were brilliant, but they were also burning, and Jackson had been burned before. He thought about his own band, the people he had worked with over the years, the friendships that didn't survive the studio, the relationships that ended because the music demanded too much. He thought about the women he had loved and lost, the ones who showed up in his songs under different names, but with the same grief. He thought about what it cost to be part of something bigger than yourself, and whether that cost was ever truly worth it. He thought about the nights on the road when he felt like he was disappearing into the songs, becoming less of a person and more of a voice. He thought about how hard he had worked to protect his own vision, his own perspective, his own truth. Fleetwood Mac wasn't asking him to write a song. They weren't asking him to produce a track. They were asking him to step into a fire that was already raging, to walk into a room where every conversation was a landmine, to sit between people who had once loved each other and now couldn't look each other in the eye without feeling pain. They were asking him to give up his own vision, his own voice, his own carefully built world, to help save theirs. And Jackson wasn't sure he could do that. He wasn't sure anyone could. Jackson Browne had spent his entire career protecting his voice, not his singing voice, his perspective, the quiet, careful way he looked at the world, the refusal to rush, the belief that a song should breathe, that it should leave space for the listener to step inside and make it their own. Fleetwood Mac didn't work that way. They were loud, layered, tangled. Their songs were puzzles made of 3 different voices fighting for the same melody. It was beautiful chaos, held together by sheer skill and stubbornness, and Jackson wasn't sure he belonged in that chaos. He wasn't sure he could survive it without losing the thing that made him who he was. He thought about it for 2 days. He walked around Los Angeles, through neighborhoods he had written songs about. He sat at his piano and played chords without purpose. He talked to friends who knew both him and Fleetwood Mac, people who understood the industry and the cost of collaboration. Some said he should do it, that it would be the opportunity of a lifetime. Others said he should stay away, that Fleetwood Mac was a sinking ship and he would go down with them. But Jackson didn't listen to any of them. Not really. He listened to the quiet voice inside him, the one that had guided every song he had ever written, the one that told him the truth even when the truth was hard. He called Mick back 2 days later. The conversation was short. Mick asked if he'd thought about it. Jackson said he had. There was a pause, heavy with hope and fear. Mick asked if he was in, and Jackson could hear the desperation barely hidden beneath the calm. And Jackson Browne, who had spent 2 days weighing the cost, who had imagined himself in that studio, surrounded by broken people making beautiful music, who had felt the weight of what they were asking him to carry, said 2 words: "I can't." Mick didn't respond right away. The silence on the line stretched long enough that Jackson almost spoke again, almost tried to explain, almost apologized, but he didn't. He let the silence do its work. Because silence was the only honest answer. Not "I am too busy," not "I'm not interested," not "maybe another time." Just the plain, simple, devastating truth. He couldn't do it. He couldn't walk into that room and be what they needed without losing what made him who he was. He couldn't save them without drowning himself. Mick finally spoke. His voice was softer, sadder, but not angry. He said he understood. He said he respected it. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince. He didn't offer more money or more credit or more control, because Mick Fleetwood knew what Jackson knew, that some rescues aren't meant to happen, that some people are built to stand alone, that saying no isn't the same as giving up. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's the only way to survive. When the call ended, Jackson sat in his living room for a long time. The afternoon light came through the window in long golden bars that moved slowly across the floor. He picked up his guitar, the same one he had written Running on Empty on, the same one that had been with him through every tour, every late night, every moment of doubt. He played a few chords, slow and deliberate, and let them hang in the air. They sounded like goodbye, they sounded like relief. He thought about what would have happened if he'd said yes. He would have walked into that studio the next week. He would have met Lindsay's eyes and seen the exhaustion there, the barely contained anger. He would have listened to Stevie sing and felt the weight of everything she wasn't saying. He would have sat next to Christine and heard the sadness in her perfect chords. He would have tried to help. He would have given everything he had, and in trying he would have lost something that couldn't be measured in album sales or critical praise. Not his talent, not his skill, but the thing that made his songs his. The quietness, the restraint, the space between the notes. Fleetwood Mac was a band that filled every inch of sound. Jackson Browne was a writer who believed in what wasn't played. Those two things couldn't live in the same room, not without one of them disappearing, not without one of them being swallowed by the other. Back in the studio, Mick hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, staring at nothing. Then he took a breath and walked back inside. Stevie looked at him from across the room. She didn't ask what Jackson said. She already knew from the look on Mick's face. Lindsay didn't look up from his guitar. Christine kept playing the same chord progression she'd been working on for a week, the one that wasn't quite right but was close. John came back in from outside, smelling like smoke and resignation, and sat down at his bass without a word. No one said anything. They went back to work, 'cause that's what they did. They worked, they fought, they made music even when it hurt. They finished the album without Jackson Browne. It wasn't their best work. It didn't have the fire of Rumors or the strange experimental beauty of Tusk. Critics were polite but not enthusiastic. Fans bought it because it was Fleetwood Mac, but it didn't stay in their hearts the way the earlier albums had. But it existed, and maybe that was enough. They didn't fall apart that year. They didn't quit. They kept making music, even when the room felt too small and the past felt too heavy. They did it alone, the way they always had, the way they probably always would. Jackson Browne didn't think about Fleetwood Mac for a long time after that. He went back to his own work. He wrote songs about distance and memory, and the way time changes everything without asking permission. He toured small theaters where the sound was clean, and the crowds were quiet and respectful. He stayed in his lane, the one he had carved out for himself over years of careful work, and he didn't apologize for it. He didn't explain himself in interviews. He didn't justify his choices. He just kept making the music only he could make. Years later, a journalist asked him about the call, about Mick Fleetwood, about what it felt like to say no to one of the biggest bands in the world. Jackson didn't hesitate. He said it wasn't about them. It was about him, about knowing what he could carry and what he couldn't, about an understanding that collaboration only works when both sides have room to breathe. Fleetwood Mac didn't have room. They were already drowning in each other. Adding another voice, even a good one, wouldn't have saved them. It would have just made the water higher. The journalist pressed. They wanted drama. They wanted to know if he regretted it, if he ever wondered what might have happened, if he thought about the music they could have made together, the songs that would never exist. Jackson smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that comes from knowing something true and sad at the same time, the smile of someone who made a hard choice and lived with it long enough to know it was right. He said regret wasn't the right word. He said he thought about it sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep, or when he heard one of their songs on the radio. He thought about Stevie's voice and Lindsay's guitar and Christine's unshakable grace. He thought about what it would have felt like to stand in that room and try to hold them together with his presence, his words, his songs. And every time he thought about it, he arrived at the same place, the same two words, I can't. Not because he didn't care, not because he didn't respect them, but because caring isn't always enough. Respect isn't always enough. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is step back. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you're not the answer. Sometimes love looks like saying no, Fleetwood Mac went on to make more albums. Some were good, some were forgettable, some were experiments that confused their fans. They broke up and got back together more times than anyone could count. Lindsay left in anger and bitterness. Stevie stayed, the last original voice. Christine came back after years away, older and quieter. John stayed in the background, playing his bass like a man doing a job he couldn't quit. Mick held it all together with the kind of stubborn love that only drummers have, the ones who keep the beat, even when everyone else has lost the rhythm. They fought and reconciled and fought again. And through it all, impossibly, the music kept coming. Messy, beautiful, impossible music. Jackson Browne kept making his own records. He wrote about war and justice and love and time. His voice got rougher with age. His songs got quieter, more introspective. He never chased the charts the way he had in the 70s. He didn't need to. He had said what he needed to say, and he had said it in his own voice on his own terms. That was the thing he had protected when he said no to make Fleetwood. Not his pride, not his ego, not his career, his voice. The quiet, honest, careful voice that made his songs sound like conversations with an old friend. In the end, no one remembers the album Fleetwood Mac made after that phone call. Music historians don't talk about it. Fans don't request those songs at concerts. It didn't change music, it didn't redefine anything, it was just another album by a band trying to survive. But the moment Jackson Browne said, "I can't," something else changed. Not in the world, not in the industry, not in any measurable way, but in the quiet space where an artist decides who they are and what they're willing to sacrifice. Because saying no isn't failure, it's clarity. It's the recognition that not every fire is yours to walk through, that not every drowning person can be saved by jumping in. That sometimes the most generous thing you can do is stay on the shore and let them find their own way out. That sometimes survival means knowing your limits and respecting them. Mick Fleetwood never called Jackson again, not because he was angry or hurt, but because he understood, and Jackson never regretted the call, not because he didn't care about what happened to them, but because he knew. He knew what it cost to be part of something that big, that broken, that beautiful, and he knew he couldn't pay that cost without losing himself. The studio was still cold that afternoon. The silence was still heavy, but Fleetwood Mac kept playing, and somewhere across town in a quieter room with better light, Jackson Browne picked up his guitar and played alone. 2 separate rooms, 2 separate paths. Both of them making music, both of them surviving in the only way they knew how. And maybe that was the thing no one needed to say out loud, that survival doesn't always look like coming together. Sometimes it looks like knowing when to walk away. Sometimes it looks like 2 words spoken quietly into a phone with no anger and no shame and no apology. I can't. Not because the world is cruel, not because people don't care, but because some things are sacred. And the voice you use to sing your truth is one of them. The voice that makes you who you are. The voice that cannot be borrowed or shared or given away. Even for something beautiful, the light faded in both rooms that evening. The music continued, and the moment passed into history, not as a headline, but as a whisper. A reminder that strength isn't always about saying yes, that courage isn't always about showing up. That sometimes the hardest thing to do and the rightest thing to do are exactly the same. Jackson Browne never joined Fleetwood Mac, and because of that, both of them kept making the music only they could make, separate, unbroken, still burning but in their own fires, still singing but in their own voices, and maybe that's all any artist can ask for in the end, not to be part of everything, not to save everyone, but to remain whole in the one thing that matters, the thing that belongs to them alone, the quiet, sacred thing that cannot be given away.